Vandana Shiva's work has been extraordinarily influential. I first heard Vandana speak at the 4th International Feminist Book Fair in 1990. That was just after the initial release of Staying Alive. And when you go back and read Staying Alive now, you think, this was written then? You know, it's absolutely current now. But I really got to know Vandana's work through her book that was jointly written with Maria Mies, Ecofeminism. And that was we published that in 1993. At the end of 1993, I attended a conference in Bangladesh that was organised by Farida Akhtar, who's a very well-known activist who runs an organisation called Ubanig and a bookstore called Narigantha Pravatana. And I don't know if I met you there, but if I didn't meet you there, I certainly got to know more about your work at the time. And I spent some days in a group with 64 amazing women around the world, including Maria Mies, whom I'd met a couple of years earlier, and the co-publisher of Spinifex, Renata Klein, had worked with her in the preceding years. It was at this conference that inspired me to start working on my book, Wild Politics, and I was soon embarking on a catch-up read. And part of that catch-up reading program was Monocultures of the Mind, which sadly we don't publish, but you know, I would if I could. It's a fantastic book, and even the title, you know, it says so much. And certainly my thinking about biodiversity was very much influenced by your work, Vandana. So I just wanted to start asking something about biodiversity, because one of the things that you write about in Making Peace with the Earth, you actually say corporate control thrives on monocultures. Bringing back biodiversity to our farms goes hand in hand with bringing back small farmers on the land. Citizens' food freedom depends on biodiversity. So why is biodiversity important? And what is the threat of monocultures?
Well, I think the threat of monocultures is first to the mind itself, because the mind wants to be diverse, wants to be multifunctional. And a monoculture of the mind has already impoverished human thought. But when that impoverished thought is from the top, then it gets associated with violence. It gets associated with devaluation. So over the years, you know, when I come to Australia, I look at the eucalyptus in its home, and it belongs here. But I was compelled to do a study way back in the late 80s on eucalyptus monocultures that were spreading in India. And it was very mysterious, because I was teaching in Bangalore those days, and overnight 30% of the land had gone to eucalyptus. So we decided to figure out what was happening. And it turned out, of course, the World Bank was financing eucalyptus cultivation in order to increase pulp supply. But every study showed that whether it was in the forest or it was on a farm, eucalyptus produced more. And the question that was never answered was more of what? For whom? And I would go into the rainforest and find lush forests and these impoverished monocultures of eucalyptus, nothing growing under them. Or the study we did on eucalyptus impact, where not a thing would grow 30 meters from the eucalyptus plantation, because in a zone where you get very, very little rain, it takes up every drop of rain. So that's when I realized, I physically saw, and then in Punjab, I saw fields that had nothing but monocultures of rice and wheat. And up in our Himalayan farms, we have some farms with 250 species. And I could see there's more. And I realized that there is a cultivated blindness, which is the monoculture of the mind.
I remember seeing a picture of eucalyptus in your book, and I've never seen a eucalyptus shaped like that. Because in Australia, eucalyptus, you know, they're all over the place. Whereas in Australia, what we have is plantations of Pinus radiata, and nothing grows under them. So we have the same problem, but with the opposite tree.
Yes.
the wrong trees in the wrong place.
In India, we have a problem with the pine and the eucalyptus. Everything linear.
Yeah, they're all really pointy like that, and they're shaped like this. And they don't look like any trees that you see just beside the road.
And Susan, you know, my first involvement, as Meera mentioned, was with the Chipko movement. And the women of the Himalaya understood that these go where you want to trees were the real protectors of the watershed. And so they said, we're going to have these trees, you can't cut them. We managed to get a logging ban in the catchment of the Ganga, which was the first environmental victory. In fact, everything in environmental regulation came after that. Years later, I'm sitting with a forest officer who's saying, you know, you people have been really counterproductive. I said, how? And he says exactly this. He said, all these oak trees you want to protect go all over the place. Whereas if we had pine, you know, we could cut it into logs. So the monoculture of the mine actually comes from the marketplace. And from a distance, and the military. Yeah? The military, might, the power to control, the will to control, and the market.
So one of the first foresters in the world, whose name I've now forgotten, talked about the battalions of trees. Yeah. And so, you know, that's what foresters in that sense are thinking. Yeah. Also talking about soil, in the last couple of days there's been a conference up in the University of Sydney on soil security. Now it's run by the Faculty of Agriculture and Environment, but also the US Studies Centre. Now that makes me go, huh? Something's funny going on here. And they're saying things like soil is often forgotten, or that soil and soil carbon are important for soil security. They're also saying that this is a new idea. But you know, as somebody who has a farming background, I'd say go and talk to my parents, you know, both of whom are no longer with us. But I'm just wondering, what do you think about that whole idea of soil security?
Well, we could see it coming. You know, when I wrote Soil Not Oil, it was partly out of frustration with how none of the solutions to climate change that had been offered were working. The Kyoto Protocol promoted emissions trading, turned pollution itself into a market. And instead of bringing emissions down by 5%, since the Kyoto Protocol was signed, emissions have gone up to 16%, more than they were before the Kyoto Protocol. And we'd been doing organic farming, and we'd done a 3-year study with, I think, the top ecologist of, soil ecologist of India. And I just said to him, I said, I really want to find out the difference in the soil, both in the terms of organic carbon as well as moisture conservation. Because these are the two issues linked to climate change. One, in terms of mitigation, that if you can absorb more carbon into the soil through organic matter, you've reduced a lot of the carbon dioxide. And second, when your soils have more organic matter and can conserve the moisture, then you have better adaptation. You're able to deal with that extended drought. And, you know, it didn't take any time before first you had Monsanto coming out and saying that Roundup was soil security because you didn't have to till. Because when you till, then all the carbon escapes. Then we had to put out studies that show that organic carbon is bound and can stay in the soil hundreds of years. It's not sitting on the top waiting to escape and become carbon dioxide. In the meantime, we started to become very critical of the biofuel industry because of the subsidies, because of the land grab that was going on, and the fact that it was a net negative energy system. You used more fossil fuels to produce the biofuel than you substituted. So for a while, the biofuel industry was on the defensive. And then they read all this stuff that's coming out from this soil security group, which I call the carbon reductionism group, because they've reduced everything to carbon. And because they can't think of living carbon, they've turned it into dead carbon. Either they mine the dead carbon as fossil fuel, or now they want to take basically the remnant. You know, when you make biofuel, then a lot of the biomass has been turned into the equivalent of charcoal. You know, it's been cooked literally without oxygen. And they now say that this is biochar, and it's the way to fix the carbon. And I said, no, the carbon, this is the level of discussions we have. No, the carbon gets fixed when photosynthesis takes place in the green leaf of the plant, not in the furnace. And that's the level of distortion. But there's an army out there, and they're investing in very large amounts. And they had forgotten about the soil. For them, soil was inert, soil was dead. It was just a container for chemical fertilizer. Now it's a container for their industrial waste and industrial pollution.
And if you left it up to the leaf, you wouldn't be able to count it. It wouldn't be a market commodity. It wouldn't be worth anything, would it?
They are doing that too, though, Susan. My last trip was to Rio, which they shifted. It was supposed to have been in early June, linked to World Environment Day. And I don't know what the connection was because of the Queen's Jubilee. They shifted it. Not that the people who go to the Jubilee go to Rio. They shifted it. Anyway, so they shifted it to the end of June. And the big conflict in Rio, in the lead up to Rio, and in Rio, and I think in the follow-up from Rio, is this thing they call the green economy now. And the green economy basically is not just naming as green everything that you take from nature. Biofuel is part of the green economy. Land grab is part of the green economy. The soil security is part of the green economy. But worse, because some of us as ecologists, in order to show how much harm was being done, did work out the ecological functions of ecosystems. So for example, we stopped mining in Dehradun and Meera's mother's from that town. In 1982, the Ministry of Environment asked me to look at mining, and we did the costs. And we said, okay, if we destroyed all the limestone where the water is held, we would have to build a water system for the valley. What would that cost? We knew the volume of water that these aquifer supplies, and we knew what it would cost. It was about 200 billion rupees. And that's what was put in front of the courts, to say the limestone in the mountain is performing a bigger economic function than the limestone extracted out of the mountain. And a whole discipline of ecological economics has grown with this idea of how to know how much harm you're causing. But they're turning it around, and now it is, how do you know what the price of a function is? And there is an entire negotiation linked to climate change called RED. The language is, I can't keep track with the abbreviations anymore. It's reduced emissions from avoided deforestation. Yeah? And it's, what are they actually doing? They're saying, okay, this forest or this tree absorbs this much carbon. And therefore we will put that function of the forest on the market. And investors are going to invest in it. And the conflict begins there, because indigenous people are saying, but if you're going to trade in our forest, sooner or later you'll want to control it. You're going to tell us how we use it. You're going to start planting GM trees for pulping. And you'll call that the more efficient forest, because if you cook up the figures, and all traders, all investors and bankers cook up figures. I mean, every day's front page news these days is which bank has which rogue trader who was caught now. And the whole issue of turning something into a financialization and a capital value is linked to manipulation of the highest kind. So they are literally taking the green leaf and trying to put its functions on the market.
So do you think that what happened in Rio, do you think anything positive came out of Rio +20?
I think the official declaration is as weak as you could make it. Frankly, anything as serious as the Earth Summit, if there was a 20-year later meeting, the first thing they should have done is, okay, we agreed to conserve species. What is the state of species 20 years later? We agreed to reduce climate instability. What is the state of the climate 20 years later? Where did the implementation fail? How do we make up for that? That would have been the normal piece of work you do 20 years after making a commitment. But since Copenhagen, we have seen the attempt has been to dismantle the treaties of Rio. The climate treaty is as good as gone. It's been replaced by this silly thing called the Copenhagen Accord, where Bush ran in, and sat with a group that was called now the BRICS, and said, let's get rid of this treaty and let's just sign. And Evo Morales called it the agreement of the polluters, because they literally were the worst polluters. Australia was left out, but you know.
But that doesn't mean we're not one of the worst.
No, absolutely. So, I think on the official level, it was really just a U-turn, as I have written. But I think there were two really powerful things happening. I think compared to the fragmentation in Rio, in the environmental movement, where, you know, the toxics people talked about toxics, and the tiger people talked about tigers, and the rainforest people talked about rainforests, and the ocean people talked about ocean forests. And nobody talked to each other. They were all in their silos. I think the entire ecology movement has really taken a quantum leap. And I think this whole issue of the rights of Mother Earth as a defining issue, they've got to shift our centering away from corporate control, away from anthropocentric, away from patriarchal constructs, to the earth as a defining thing, and then all of the modes that flow out of that. I think the other exciting thing for me was tiny countries are starting to do something different. And part of it is because they have too little to gain in this setup. So, for example, Bhutan has given up gross national product and has adopted gross national happiness. And it's their official indicator. They have, their planning commission is the planning commission for happiness. And the Prime Minister has invited Nathania, the movement has started in India for organic farming, to help make Bhutan 100% organic. And as he wrote in his letter, he says, I cannot see any other way to grow happiness but to grow organic. So they had, amazing sessions. It's a tiny little country, nobody even knows it exists. But they did work in the lead-up at the UN General Assembly. They had a whole session where the governments were making a line to beg to speak, because everyone wanted to be seen on the right side. And then there's Ecuador, which a few years ago, and the president says he was inspired by staying alive. They wrote into the constitution, they got rid of their old constitution, he wrote into the new constitution through a lot of consultation, the rights of nature. And they have a constitutional court defending these rights. In fact, in August, to go back. So under this, what they've done is they've taken a large part of the Amazon. And I think Australia should learn something from there. And they call it the Yasuni Initiative. They said, we're going to leave the oil underground to protect the forest, to protect its biodiversity, to protect the indigenous people, to protect the cultures of the indigenous people. And they're going ahead with it, seriously, in a big, big way.
That's fantastic. I mean, there's also places like Palau, which is a tiny little island in Melanesia, and they have
the nuclear-free
island. You know, it's fantastic. Well, little places, sometimes, that's where the really interesting stuff happens, right on the margins.
But I really, that's my political philosophy.
Yeah.
The small and the margin is where the future will emerge. Not at the center and not at the top.
No, quite. Making peace with the earth. The first half of the book you framed around the idea of war. A war against the earth in terms of eco-apartheid, land grabs, water wars, climate and forest wars. So what is it about all of these that you're actually seeing as a war? Why is it a war?
Well, if you look at the eco-apartheid part, I realized that it's a war in the mind to begin with. I mean, this is a theme that has stayed with me since staying alive. That, when Bacon says you've got to rape nature to know her, you've defined a war. And this separation in the mind does two things. One is it doesn't allow you to know what harm you're causing, because you've separated yourself. And the second is it gives you the arrogance that you are now free of that which you depend on. What patriarchy does to women, that you suddenly say, the breadwinner, It's not the breadwinner.
Not the bread maker, that's for sure.
So I really, just like Monocultures of the Mind sort of hit me and said, there's something going on in the head where you can't see this obvious diversity. There's something going on in the head where societies organized in the most intensive way in dependence on resources pretend they are free of nature. And societies that have the most light foot in terms of living are fully aware of their dependence on nature. So it's a serious paradox. And apartheid means separation. So eco-apartheid is a war in the mind of ecological separation, in the mind of nature. It then allows us to perpetrate all the violence against the land, against the water. I mean, we are dealing with, and I've written about it in Making Peace, 500 dams on a tiny little stretch that the Ganges is before it hits the plains. It's not very long. You can trek it in 2 days. And they want to build on the Ganges and the tributaries 500 dams. Already large stretches of the Ganges is not running. There's no water. This is our sacred river. And 30 million people will go in January and February until April to the Kumbh Mela, thinking this water is the water of the Ganges. It won't be the water of the Ganges, it's all dammed down. It's a tributary. So there's a war against the rivers, there's a war against the sea. So much of my work is, around the seas in the last 25 years since I started Lavdani. But it's also a war, and the theme of Making Peace with the Earth started with the Sydney Peace Prize. That was the lecture. And this book grew out of that lecture. But this was the time when we were having to organize to stop the war against people, because the war against the earth is a resource grab. But when you have to grab resources, you have to push off people. So the war against the earth becomes a war against people. And I remember Australia, it's the uranium thing. So often, coal, I don't know, everywhere it's the same. But no, you don't just push off people, you criminalize them. And in India, that's why the Sydney Peace Prize lecture took the shape it did. That April we had to organize an entire people's tribunal on what was happening in the tribal areas, which was a war against people. Our friends like Binayak Sen, if any of you are doctors, you have heard of Dr. Binayak Sen. My sister's dear, dear friend, thrown into jail as a Naxalite. The Naxalite is the word for extreme left, because or the Maoists, so whatever, they choose the name according to what they want to. And our Home Minister calls it the biggest security threat of India.
Green is the word for extreme left here in the last week.
Well, green gets all kinds of interpretations, doesn't it? But just, I think it was 27th of last month. And this is such a touching story, Susan. The central heartland of India has become a war zone, with the tribals trapped between the paramilitary forces, militias, I think created very much like Central America. We used to hear those stories. But, tribals themselves are armed to kill fellow tribals. And then the growing movement of the Maoists. And let me just take a minute to explain this. 1996, we managed to pass through a law in our country which said, as far as tribal areas are concerned, the lands of the indigenous people, the original inhabitants, these areas will be governed by the people themselves. And the local village will be the highest authority. This law is called the Panchayati Raj Extension to Scheduled Areas. It basically means self-rule in tribal areas. Now, coming out with this, you remember 95 is WTO, 96 is this law. By 97, 98, the companies are starting to descend on India. Steel companies, iron ore companies, and they come to the villages and say, we want this land. And the villagers will sit. And I've been at these meetings where they would call us to be witness with them. Well, they sing and dance all night and sit and discuss all day and sing and dance all night and discuss all day. They take 3 days to build a consensus and say, no, all the millions they want to give us is just not worth it. We stay here in our forest, live our culture. this would happen in place after place after place. So democracy said no to globalization. And then the companies started to put pressure on the government to say, get these guys off the land. And that's when they started to militarize. And we have seen this militarization grow, and our Home Minister called this the Green Hunt, Operation Green Hunt, the color green again. So we did this tribunal, as a result of which we were able to split the ruling party into two camps, so he couldn't go ahead. But just in 27, this central part of India is also the home of diversity of rice. You know, India used to have 200,000 varieties of rice. And Dr. Risharia, who taught me seed saving, had documented these rices. This is the area where they still have seed festivals. You couldn't evolve 200,000 rice varieties without being the ultimate scientist of seed. So the women have the most serious ways in which they do the breeding and selection and celebration. 27th night, through the night, because they meet all night, all day, all night, all day. They were discussing how to plant according to the season, the fact that there was a drought, the fact that some people have been killed, and therefore who will look after the lands of the abandoned lands. And in the middle of the night, 26 people were killed, many of them children, 12 years, 14 years, and the Home Minister called them Maoists. He said it was an encounter. So it is a war at every level. It was, for me, when I wrote Staying Alive, metaphorically a war. Today it is physically a war. Because, maybe I should just add this. I think what globalization did was push the state into the lap of the corporations and made the state a corporate state. And then when the impact started to get felt and people started to respond, and we organized, whether it was Seattle or it was Genoa or Melbourne, World Economic Forum, or the forests of Chhattisgarh, that's when the corporation said, a state is not good enough, we've got to have a militarized state. So the level at which we are and the time at which I'm writing, Making Peace with the Earth, is there's only one way this model can carry on. And it is in that militarized form. Democracy will not allow it to flourish. So either we'll have democracy and this model will die before killing the rest of the planet and people, or it'll carry on with bailout after bailout, including the military bailout, which is what we're saying.
In Australia, I'm just going to move towards the urban world. In Australia, we have two big supermarket chains, Coles and Woolworths, who've been doing things like selling milk at a price that the dairy farmers can't actually produce it. So India has always had a fantastic street life with small traders and lots of local produce and all sorts of things. So what's happening in the urban areas now?
Well, that same military assault that's taking place in the forest is taking place in urban areas. We are victims of it. When I was eating dinner with you today, I was thinking of this wonderful cafe we had built, because we had mixed zone planning. And India as an economy has grown with your business being in the front room and you live at the back. Or your business is on the ground floor and you live on the top. And that's how any organic society has evolved. And with globalization, they started to build all these supermarkets outside. And they had to flush out people from the city. Who on earth would go 20 miles out to shop for something? So suddenly we had an operation called sealing. Now the British had left amazing remnants that are coming so alive, I grew up in independent India. And suddenly things that we had never known are getting born again. The sealing is, the police comes and puts a lock on your door, puts cloth around it, and there's this red seal. So of the older people here,
like a wax seal.
Wax seal. Put a seal. Can't enter your own house. Our cafe was closed, our library was closed, and they did this across the city. And then it turned out, none of this happens just like that. It turned out the judge who gave this ruling to change the zoning had two sons in the building industry, building supermarkets on the outskirts. One of the areas in which I'm very deeply involved is how, we had laws for food safety. They were called the prevention of food adulteration. Basically, the idea was anything you add to food that's not food is adulteration, and it should be prevented. So if Coca-Cola puts phosphoric acid in the drink to give you a ting, it's adulteration. How did we come to know of this law? Inside the court, we sued Coca-Cola. The Coca-Cola lawyer is putting up this draft and saying, you can't try us under the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act because there's a new law coming. They knew about the law, our parliamentarians didn't. And that law is called the Food Standards and Safety Act of India, written by American lawyers. And the governance of the expert committees of the Coca-Colas, because it's designed for the Pepsis and Cokes and the Nestles to have a monopoly in the food system and to destroy all local processing, production, street foods. So 98, when they started to dump soya, GM soya on us, I did an action, because the women called me and said, we want our mustard back, and we did a civil disobedience against the banning of mustard. 1 million units making virgin oil in the villages closed, because these new laws say if you don't have a chemist and a lab, no, 2 chemists and a lab in your employ, your food is dangerous. It could be the purest virgin cold-pressed oil extracted in front of your eyes. So the industrial system then becomes the measure. And the 2 cities of India, and old Delhi also, Indore has the most amazing food culture. At night, when the shops are closed, the streets become one eating place. And the most delicious food, I've eaten there when I'm gone. Madurai never goes to sleep, where the Madurai Meenakshi temple is, never goes to sleep. The police has been focusing on these 2 towns to shut down the street foods. And it's so easy, you suddenly declare a practice of centuries as illegal because you've suddenly decided only industrial practices will work. I call it food fascism.
And does this have anything to do with the entry of Walmart into India?
A lot. I just sued Walmart.
Did you?
The notices have been sent.
Okay, please keep us informed.
But Walmart, you see, in 2005, our Prime Minister, who's totally in love with President Bush, went and signed the agreement on nuclear. Yeah? It was called the US-India Nuclear Agreement. But on the same day, he signed another agreement, which is less known. It's called the US-India Knowledge Agreement in Agriculture. So one would think it's about knowledge. Who sits on the board? Monsanto, Walmart, Conagra. What's the agenda? Basically, Walmart should control the seed supply in India. Walmart should control the retail. And Conagra, Cargill should control the trade in food grains. We had protests, we didn't allow Walmart's entry then, but 2007 they managed to get an entry into wholesale cash and carry through a joint venture with an Indian company. Now they weren't supposed to enter into the retail business, but they've been very clever. Just like Monsanto has. Monsanto formed a joint venture with Mahiko, and then it entered the Indian market, and it controls 95% of the cotton seed supply in India now. And most of the farmers' suicides are in those zones where Monsanto is taking control. So Walmart joins up with Bharti, which is the big telecom service. And it's interesting how suddenly a telecom service becomes a retail giant. And I noticed these stores popping up. And I kind of know the pace by which Indian organizations grow because we do fair trade and we do organic. And we know how difficult it is to take the next store and the next. Within no time, 170 new stores of Easy Day came up. So we started to do the research. And what we basically sued Walmart for is we're saying they're using the Bharti retail as a front to enter the retail sector. And the reason we had to do it was last December, again this issue of FDI and retail, which is Walmart in India, came up in a big way. And protests again. Mamata Banerjee, I don't know if any of you are familiar with her, she was not a very big politician, but she sided with the peasants who were fighting the Tata nano factory on the land grab issues, and created a slogan which I think is very smart. Ma Mati Manush. Mother, the soil, and humanity. This is what I stand for. Shot up, became the chief minister, and is a big partner for the ruling coalition. So when they tried to push Walmart, she said, I'm not going to agree. Because in Calcutta, a lot of people make their living as hawkers on the street. Guess what's happened between December and now? Hillary Clinton has come, flown in to Calcutta to try and persuade Mamata to not be a bloc. And I think something's wrong if the Secretary of State of the most powerful country has to run all over the world doing petty errands for a corporation. Because that's what it is, isn't it? And our government has announced that in August they're going to announce Walmart's entry to India. So we said we better file a case fast. And luckily the courts have admitted it and served notice.
But you've had very similar problems with Monsanto too. And one of the things that Marie-Monique Robin, who wrote the book The World According to Monsanto, writes about, is the revolving door. And the revolving door means that people who've worked at Monsanto then go into work for the FDA. So the man, Martin Taylor, who used to be big in Monsanto, is currently Obama's advisor. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think something like that. And I'm just wondering, you know, why do you think, I mean, is this the reason why Monsanto keeps getting away with all its criminal activities?
Definitely the one who should have been regulated has become the regulator. And that's what the nature of a corporate state is. It is a revolving door. In the European Commission, approvals used to be given by the Commissioner for Environment for GMOs. Suddenly they created again, it's always food safety. EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. And my dear friend José Bové, who's now a European parliamentarian, he revealed how so many of the officials of EFSA had links with the biotech industry. And some of them had to resign because of what happened. In India, we just had a case where a senior government official first gave approvals to his wife for an illegitimate, illegal GM trial, GMV, rice. And now he's announcing, he does genetic engineering himself, he's announcing that the 400,000 collections of seeds in our public gene bank should be handed over to the corporations. And of course he plays the role so beautifully, he says, because we are incapable of adding value. So I'll have to do something about that. But it is, and as far as the US is concerned, it is tragic that Obama, who won on the basis of change we can believe in, the one thing he could not change was the officials of Monsanto in his administration. They all stayed. The same people who served under Bush stayed under Obama. The policies actually got worse. Obama brought over from the Gates Foundation this doctor who is now head of USAID, and USAID has a policy that they will only give aid for agriculture to any country if it is for GMOs. We've just had a huge mobilization in Nepal. They tried to force Haiti after the earthquake to take these seeds, and the Haiti, I mean, how many peasants do they have, but they still had a protest. And I don't know if you followed recently, the Congress in US has, they have this funny system of lawmaking there, where you have a law on certain things, or it's usually budgetary law, and inside it they will put a little clause. And in one of these agriculture expenditure laws, bills, they put in that no court can stop GM trials. No court. And the USDA can't regulate them. Which basically means Monsanto has absolutely free play, because some of the courts have been stopping the trials of beet and alfalfa. So it is, and it's from Monsanto's own mouth. I started to save seeds 87 when these companies made it clear they wanted to do genetic engineering in order to have patents on seeds. When the WTO was established and the intellectual property rights law called the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement came into force, immediately a Monsanto representative at a Congress in Washington said, in writing this treaty, we have been the patient, diagnostician, and physician all in one. We defined a problem, and for them the problem was that farmers are saving seeds. And we offered a solution that now it should be a crime. And that's the kind of moment we are in, where everything that is vital to human survival, everything that is vital to our freedom is being defined as a crime. And every criminal act is being defined as freedom. And Monsanto, of course, tops the list.
I think it's interesting that you raised Bill Gates, because actually that was going to be my next question. But one of the things that he's putting out there is that genetically modified foods will solve world hunger. What's your view on that?
Well, as far as genetically modified foods solving world hunger is concerned, you should read our report. It's called The GMO Emperor Has No Clothes. Monsanto was putting out all these ads all over the papers, 250,000 Indian farmers have committed suicide, and they're talking about Bt cotton as India's pride, farmers' pride. So I thought the only way to counter the ads was to get the movements of every country to write authentic reports of what was happening on the ground. Australia with the canola farmers, Brazil with what's happened with soya, Argentina, Percy Smyser, the canola farmer in Canada, US farmers, in India, the cotton story. And no matter where in the world you are, the three myths of genetic engineering get exposed. First, there is no gain in yield at all. The technology is incapable of doing it because the technology can only add a new gene, whereas the yield comes from the composite plant created through conventional breeding. Genetic engineering is not a shortcut to breeding. It has to ride on whatever breeding you've had, open pollinated or hybrid or whatever. And the yield characteristics come from the original plant, not from the genetic manipulation. The toxic genes come from the genetic manipulation. Bt genes, Bacillus thuringiensis, or Roundup Ready genes. This was supposed to reduce pesticides. In fact, these are the debates very often scientists will say the reason we have to have GMO is the pesticide burden is so high. Pesticide, herbicide use has just gone through the ceiling. Is it a good, smart tool? They call it a sophisticated technology. The technology should do the job it was supposed to do. This technology, they had only two applications. Bt crops to control pests, herbicide-resistant crops to control weeds. What have they given us? Super pests and super weeds. 15 million acres in the US, overtaken with super weeds that they're now having to use Agent Orange.
Another Monsanto product.
So, it's not at all true that it solved hunger. But I think Gates has a combination of a blind arrogance and philanthropy combined with commercial interest. And I'll give you just one or two examples. He's floated this thing called the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Agra. I'm saying. Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa called Agra. And I always say this Agra will not have a Taj Mahal. Basically to introduce GM seeds, commercialize the seed supply and add chemical fertilizer to it. At a time when we know the harm chemical fertilizers have done, where we know the successes of ecological farming. It's all out there. The UN Rapporteur on Food has shown how Africa can triple its food production by going organic and going ecological in its farming system. And definitely, African women with seeds in their hands, even today feed more Africans than the Gates Initiative ever will. But this is not where Gates stops. Gates is pushing hard. This is another area in which we are involved in India. He runs what is called the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Now, what is improved nutrition? It is genetically modified golden rice for vitamin A. And I have this in Making Peace, a whole section showing that it's 70 times less efficient than the normal greens we eat in our Indian food, the coriander and the curry leaves. They have 1,400 units of vitamin A, and the golden rice will give you 34, but it has 80 patents linked to it, which is a real issue. Iron fortified bread. They commissioned a whole study, World Bank, all of them together. They called it Hangama, Hunger and Malnutrition. And immediately I got hold of everyone who they were going to use. They were going to use food stars. In fact, this whole Satyameva Jayate came out of that. I wrote to Amir Khan to say, please don't go for popularizing this report, because the cover, and the cover told you all, it had a white bread. A slice of white bread as the solution for malnutrition in India. And of course saying it will be fortified with iron for the anemic women. So on every step, it's all about industry taking control, and they're waiting in the wings. I always read the footnotes. And the footnotes of our Food Security Act is really a Gates footnote. Basically, wanting industrial takeover of our feeding programs. We have midday meal schemes, the biggest school feeding program of the world. We have ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Scheme. We have the public distribution system, and on a rough calculation, that's $1 trillion market. If they get hold of the Indian public distribution of food. And then vaccines, he's into vaccines. So touch anything, Gates is there. It's not an accident. And this is the issue. And again, I've written about it in Making Peace. I'm not intending to do an advertisement for the book, but I have written about all these issues. You see, in the last few years, the technologies have combined. What was biotech has now moved on to genomics. They used to do genetic engineering, now they only read the map, the genomic map. Who reads it? Do people read it? No, computers read it. Software programs read it. That's where Gates comes in. IT and BT are becoming one. And that's where his interest is.
I like that, IT and BT. Fantastic. Okay, now we need to talk just a little bit about climate change. In Australia, we have these amazing people like Twiggy Forrest and Clive Palmer and Gina Reinhardt, as well as the big companies Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton. And they're putting forward the ideas of a man called Ian Plimer, who in 2010 did a tour with Lord Buncton. And one of the things that you say in your book is that one of the problems with the glaciologists is that most of them have started out as geologists, and so they don't actually even see the human scale, because that's just a blip in geological time. So although Plimer will say things like, well, there've always been tornadoes, there've always been droughts, there's always been tsunamis and cyclones, and that it's got nothing to do with human activity. So what's wrong with this?
I think there are two things that are wrong with this approach, that what we are doing to the planet doesn't really matter because it's a blip in this geological scale of time. Because humanity has not lived in the geological scale of time. It's lived in the period where humans were born. And in this period where humans have evolved, there's been an extremely stable climate that allowed us to evolve, allowed us to do agriculture, allowed us to do the kinds of things that have made life possible for our species. So for our species, it does matter that the climate becomes too hot or too cold. For other species, some other adaptation will take place. There will be other species. The planet will go on, which is why someone asked me to sign a card, because, you know, I used to joke and say, you know, when people would say, what's our responsibility? I said, we shouldn't think of ourselves as atlases carrying the earth on our shoulders. The earth is carrying us. Now, when you start having this atlas problem, you don't just become irresponsible because you say on the geological scale of time, it doesn't matter, but a lot of scientists who even think in terms of the narrow scale have started using the idea of Anthropocene, you know. Good scientists wrote and said, if we look at who's having the biggest impact in our time, in our period, it is the human being. And they therefore said this age should be called the Anthropocene age, where the human being has impact. Now, in my view, this should say, therefore we should reduce our footprint. We should be more responsible because this planet is not just for humans. And in any case, the humans who cause the damage aren't the ones who suffer the consequences. Up in our region, in the Himalaya, the people who are suffering because of glacial melt or drought or landslides aren't the ones who cause the problem. They don't use fossil fuel at all. They're in a biodiversity economy. A bunch of scientists, and it really comes out of this sort of will to control, the patriarchal will to control, are now talking about, oh, so we made a mess with the planet, now let's experiment a little more. Let's create artificial volcanoes. Why would you want artificial volcanoes? So that there'll be this pollution in the air, and that will lead to global cooling. Or let's shoot pollution, sulfide particles up in the sky. Same, global cooling. Let's pour iron filings onto the ocean because it'll rust and it'll take carbon dioxide out. Then you ask them, and what happens to the ocean floor? That's not my department. You ask the Nobel laureates in physics who are behind these big billion-dollar experiments on geoengineering. And when you say, okay, with all of that pollution in the air, what's going to happen to photosynthesis? Because the sun was never the problem. Blocking the sun is the problem. And they say, photosynthesis, that's for biologists. I'm doing a geoengineering experiment. So there's always a way, you know, the monoculture of the mind is this blinker of the mind. And I think this whole experimenting with the planet with no accountability is the other side to corporate greed. Because the two feed each other. If you notice now, I mean, the National Institutes, National Science Academy, which is the big funder for scientific research in America, they announced a big project called BREAD. And I actually had friends ring me up, say, Vandana, write up your line. You should write a proposal. I said, this bread is not our bread. And of course, sure enough, 90% of the grants have gone to Gates and a fellow called Craig Venter, who's the guy who pretended to have read the Book of Life, but he got it wrong by thousands of genes. You know, the Human Genome Project, he patented every gene without knowing what it does. 90% of the grants have gone to them to do what? Synthetic biology. So synthetic biology is one step beyond genetic engineering, where you take a gene and you think you know what it's doing, you don't really know, but you run through these software programs that Mr. Gates helps make, and you take a bet that this part of the genome does this, and you want it to do something else. So you think you know, so you write a software program to remove a part of the software of the DNA code and replace it with computer-written codes and create this artificial, they call it bio-bricks. And they're going to build life brick by brick, bio-brick by bio-brick. And UK has just had an experiment with a new wheat, and you know, they wanted me to help, but I said, I don't even know what this wheat is. Send me the details. I started to read it, and I think it's a synthetic biology wheat with cow genes in it. And they call it cow-like because they've removed some element of the cow gene and replaced it with a synthetic element. This is science fiction, but it's more real than science fiction.
It is, but science has always been your forte. I mean, you did your PhD in quantum physics. So I'm wondering how you got from quantum physics to becoming an activist in ecology, and what's the link there?
Chip code.
Chip code. How?
Yeah. Well, I mean, even as a student, I would run up to the hills and volunteer with the movement. And part of it was before I was leaving for Canada to do my PhD. I just wanted to go to my favorite spots and trek in my favorite forests and swim in my favorite streams. And the forests weren't there and the streams weren't there. So, you know, we have these little chai shops up in the Garhwal, in our mountain area. And I was very frustrated, and I'm talking to this dhabawala and saying, my God, the stream, I used to swim in it 2 years ago. And you know, they, again, World Bank financed an apple orchard, chopped down the forest catchment. But he said, you know, but now people have started to act, and there's the Chipko movement. And I said, what's the Chipko movement? So I was leaving for my PhD, but I said, the first thing I'm going to do when I come back is visit the Chipko movement. And I started to spend every vacation volunteering, because there was nothing I could do there. Women knew everything, but they didn't know how to read, and they didn't know how to write. So I could start doing their reports. That's how I became an ecologist, so-called, you know. And I always say that was my University of Ecology. But the other thing they don't know how to do is make graphs. And all you have to do is make a graph. Oh my God. You just make a graph. And, you know, from English to a graph, it's like a double leap in knowledge. But those started to get taken seriously by the government. And, but I was still kind of walking the 2 feet, you know. You're still in university, still doing philosophy of science, science policy. And it's when the government asked me to do a study on mining in Dehradun, which is my home, and I was then in Bangalore. I came back, did the study, went to the Supreme Court, the mines were shut down, and I said a 6-month study could save an entire valley and rewrite policy. Mines were totally shut down, all polluting industry, cement plants, calcium carbide plants, all shut down, and our valley declared a green zone. And that's when I said it's a bit selfish to kind of just entertain my own mind, because that's what ultimately academics is about. You know, you play intellectual games with yourself. And you have fun, you know. I have to say, intellectually, it's very, very exciting. And I, at that point, said, okay, 10 years I'm going to take off and serve the community and do ecological work. Because we were talking about 82, no globalization. You know, shut down a few bad policies. We were going to have a democratic India. And then comes WTO and all of that. So the 10 years got extended.
We're going to have to wind up fairly soon, but there is one thing that you wrote about in Monocultures of the Mind. You said, sacred groves, sacred seeds, sacred species have been cultural means to treat biodiversity as inviolable. There's an interesting overlap here between spirit and matter, and I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about that. I mean, especially in a time when we've got the Higgs boson and we've got dark matter finally coming into existence or being recognised.
Well, you know, I think matter was never pure matter of the Cartesian Newtonian revolution. That was a convenient construct for 200 years. And it served industry well. But it never served science well. And so we got quantum theory, which already said, but there's nothing like a particle. Yeah, becomes a wave. It only becomes a particle when you actually get down to measuring it. And the measurement creates the particle. And my thesis was on non-separability in quantum theory, non-locality in quantum theory. It was becoming very clear at the deep scientific level that this interconnectedness is what defines reality. And constant moving into different phases. The wave becomes the particle, and the particle becomes the wave. Energy levels become matter. Matter becomes energy. Space and time constantly morph into each other. And yet the old mechanistic physics has left us with a worldview which still equips our normal everyday thinking. That the world is made of immutable hard matter that doesn't change unless you hit it on the head. Yeah? It's action by contact, action by force. Whereas when things are connected, you don't have to touch physically because things are connected anyway, which is why a butterfly can create a storm. The wings of a butterfly can create a storm, which is why the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment that you take elementary particles that have been connected, you separate them, and it doesn't matter how far apart they are. The state of one determines the other. They're not touching each other. So interconnectedness is the nature of nature. And that interconnectedness happens through other than that old immutable matter. You can call that spirit. But that connection through the non-visible, the connection through the non-catchable, is what cultures have known for so long. And what is sacred? In my view, sacred is the experience of connection and the wisdom and knowledge to know where that connection requires that you not violate. So the heart of the Indian river system, wise people just went up there and said, my God, these rivers are vital to India. They made a temple and made the river a sacred goddess. Simple. Yeah? The sacred forest, the sacred groves, you travel India, forests are gone, but suddenly you'll see in the middle of nowhere this rich grove. You get closer, oh, there's a snake goddess out there. And people respect. Or up in our Himalaya, there are seven peeps of the goddess. Forest intact. So this putting a self-conscious boundary to violation, to me that's the experience sacred. Then of course you can have all kinds of constructs of the sacred at all kinds of levels. And the beauty of it is the diversity of our consciousness and our mind allows us to construct it in so many ways to our convenience.